Hello and welcome to another edition of the Giants of the Faith podcast. My name is Robert Daniels and I'm the host of this show. And this is a show where we look at influential individuals from Christian history, learn a bit about their lives and their impact. And today we're continuing our random march through Inter-Varsity Press's Biographical Dictionary of Evangelicals. Now my son pulled random number 18, which leads us to page 18 in the book, and page 18 takes us to Jacobus Arminius, founder of the Remonstrant Movement and the archenemy of Calvinists everywhere. That's a bit of a joke, but he's the founder of one of the two primary, Molinists, views on the Doctrines of Grace. He was also a pastor, a scholar, a peacemaker, and ultimately a man who sought to defend the goodness and justice of God at all costs, even when it cost him dearly, and even when he was wrong. Arminius is a massive figure in the course of Christianity, and definitely a giant of the faith, and as such, he was already on the list of future episodes, but by happy chance we'll go ahead and cover him today, and Lord willing over the next two episodes as well. The plan is to make today's episode a biographical one, and then the next episode will kind of focus on the Synod of Dort, and then the final one will look at Arminianism today. Hopefully it comes off that way and you find this little mini-series within a series edifying. Jacobus Arminius, also known as Jacob Hermansoon, was born on October 10th, 1560, in Oudwater, a small town in the province of Utrecht in the Netherlands. His early life was shaped by significant hardships. His father's name was Harman, which is why he's sometimes referred to as Hermansoon, meaning the son of Harman. And I could find no source that contained his mother's name, unfortunately. But his family seems to have been relatively humble. His father may have been a cutler, which was somebody who made knives and tools, or maybe even weapons. When Arminius was still a young boy, his father died. The Netherlands of Arminius' youth was embroiled in the 80 Years' War, which was a bloody and bitter conflict between the Protestant Dutch provinces and their Spanish Catholic overlords. Religious persecution, political oppression, and sheer devastation were daily realities. We may look at this conflict in an upcoming bonus episode, not sure yet. In 1575, when Arminius was just 15, tragedy struck again in a deeply personal way. Spanish troops sacked his hometown, and Oudwater was devastated. Arminius' mother and siblings were killed, and he was left an orphan, effectively alone in a hostile world. It's difficult to overstate how deeply this must have affected young Arminius, and later in life, he would write with particular sensitivity about the goodness and justice of God, themes that were anything but abstract to somebody who had seen such suffering firsthand. After becoming an orphan, Arminius found support from friends and patrons who recognized his talent and abilities. Particularly, a priest named Theodorus Emilius helped sponsor his education. A year after the sack of Oudwater, Arminius went on to study theology at the newly founded University of Leiden. Leiden was not just a place of learning, but a symbol of Dutch resistance. The city had withstood a brutal Spanish siege, and its university stood as a monument to freedom, both political and intellectual. Here Arminius studied under Reformed scholars deeply loyal to the theology of John Calvin. Yet even among these luminaries, Arminius stood out. So much so that the city of Amsterdam, recognizing his potential, sponsored his further studies in Geneva under Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's immediate successor. Beza, a formidable scholar himself, represented a hardened Calvinism, one that increasingly emphasized the absolute sovereignty of God in predestining individuals to salvation or damnation. Arminius learned deeply from Beza, but even here, seeds of questions began to form in his mind. Returning to Amsterdam as a pastor in 1588, Arminius was tasked with refuting the writings of Dick Coornhert, a critic of predestination. Ironically, in studying Coornhert's arguments and re-examining Scripture, Arminius began to experience his own deep doubts about the traditional Calvinist view. One passage in particular haunted him, Romans 9. Was Paul really teaching that God unconditionally elects some individuals to salvation and others to eternal condemnation entirely apart from anything in them? Arminius later wrote in his Declaration of Sentiments, "In regard to election and reprobation, many passages of Scripture have produced in me great anxiety." He wrestled deeply, not dismissively. He wasn't seeking novelty or rebellion, so he said. He was seeking faithfulness to Scripture and to the character of God. I'm not saying he found this faithfulness, but at least that's what his motivations were. Over time, Arminius' theological views crystallized, though he remained cautious and measured in public. His core teachings can be summarized like this. Conditional election. God's predestination is based on his foreknowledge of who would freely believe. Universal atonement, which is Christ died for all, not only for the elect. Resistible grace. God's grace is necessary for salvation, but humans can resist it. And the possibility of apostasy. True believers could potentially fall from grace. In his own words, Arminius wrote, "Election is of believers, and it is the cause of faith, or the perseverance in faith and in salvation." He insisted that God does not deal with men as with stocks and blocks, nor does he treat them in such a manner that they cannot otherwise be than they are acted on by him. In other words, we're not puppets. According to Arminius, God's sovereignty is not mechanical or coercive. It's loving and invites genuine relationship. And in 1603, Arminius was appointed to the theological faculty at the University of Leiden, where he had a decade before been a student. His appointment was controversial from the start, as some suspected him of harboring views that strayed from the strict Calvinist orthodoxy. Initially, Arminius was careful and somewhat cautious in his lectures, emphasizing Scripture and classical Reformed doctrines. However, as he settled into his role, he began to teach more openly about his disagreements with certain aspects of Calvinist predestination. Arminius did not deny the sovereignty of God, but rather reinterpreted it. He continued to argue that God's predestination was based on his foreknowledge of human faith and decisions, not on an absolute decree independent of human will. This stood in stark contrast, of course, to the dominant Calvinist view that God had unconditionally elected some to salvation and others to damnation without regard to human actions. As these ideas became known, Arminius faced increasing opposition, particularly from his colleague at Leiden, Franciscus Gomarus, a fierce defender of traditional Calvinist doctrine. Their disputes became widely publicized, drawing the attention of church authorities and political leaders. By 1605, tensions between Arminius and the Calvinist establishment had deepened, and efforts were made to organize a national synod to settle the growing theological division. However, political instability in the Dutch Republic, tied up with a broader conflict of the 80 Years' War, delayed any formal action. In the later years of his life, Arminius worked to defend his views, emphasizing that his theology was still firmly rooted in the Reformation principles of grace and Scripture alone. He sought to portray his position as a moderate, reasonable correction to extreme interpretations of Calvinism, rather than a radical break with Protestant tradition. In 1608, he participated in a public debate with Gomarus before the States of Holland, the provincial government, where he famously declared, "I have never taught that a man can believe if he wishes, but I teach that the grace of God is necessary for every act of faith." But in this debate, no final resolution was reached. Sadly, Jacobus Arminius' health was failing. He suffered from tuberculosis, and despite his efforts to continue teaching and writing, he grew progressively weaker. He died on October 19th, 1609, at the age of only 49 years old. His death left many questions unresolved, but his followers would soon take up his cause, leading to the publication of the Remonstrants in 1610, and the fierce debates that culminated in the Synod of Dort. Dort was a defining moment in the history of Reformed theology. Convened in the city of Dordrecht, in the Dutch Republic, the Synod gathered ministers, theologians, and lay representatives from across Europe to resolve the growing theological controversy within the Reformed churches. We'll get into Dort in the next episode. Arminius has had a huge impact in Christianity over the last 400 years. His theology has become the almost default position in Protestant America and much of the evangelical world from about the 1800s onward, though we're now seeing some signs of the decline of Arminianism and the re-rise of Calvinism, at least in the U.S. Well, thanks for listening. On the next episode, we'll look a bit more deeply at the Synod of Dort and the immediate impact that Arminius had in Christendom. And until then, God bless.